Well, thank you all for coming. I'm Dina Mansour. I'm the Associate Director at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. And this is one of a series of outreach activities that we do to further our mission of U.S.-Asia relations and ethical public policy and leadership. And so pleased that all of you could take time to come today. I looked up a quote by Voltaire in preparing for my introduction.
Voltaire, okay, yeah. There goes my talk right there.
And this quote, it's, woe to the makers of literal translations who by rendering every word weaken the meaning. It is indeed by so doing that we can say the letter kills and the spirit gives life. But I thought that if Voltaire had met Steve Levine, who is an accomplished translator from Russian and Chinese, he would know a translator who gives real spirit to his work. And that's evidenced by this book that I've been reading that he just came out with. And he also brought Mao, the Real Story, which he also recently authored together or translated together with the primary author of Alexander Pantsov. Steve has been a tremendous mentor to me since I started at the Mansfield Center in 2009, and as has former director Terry Widener. Steve is a true Renaissance man and a very humble man. It's taken years to pry out of him some of his many accomplishments, and he's famous in my house because of a game that he developed called Panda Country, which introduces Chinese geography and culture to children. And he's been doing great activities like this throughout his life to promote U.S.-China relations, U.S.-Asia relations, not necessarily to promote them, but to shine a light on them, maybe. And it's been a great honor to have him on our campus, part of the Mansfield Center, and part of the Department of History on campus as well. So we're honored that he's here today to speak for the Mansfield Center Lecture Series on a fascinating topic with a fascinating title, The Enigma of Deng Xiaoping, Avatar of Reform or Butcher of Beijing. So please join me in welcoming Steve today.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Dina, and thanks to all of you for coming. And by the way, if any of you is an entrepreneur, the game that Dina mentioned is not in production, so if anyone would like to, we could do some, what is it called, crowdfunding? We could do that right here, something like that. But I think it's maybe the most useful thing I've ever done, actually. And there are now 5 copies extant, which I've all made, handmade myself, by the way, on my ping pong table at home. So, anyway, that's not why we're here. Okay, the first thing I'd like to say is, why is there a picture of Liu Xiaobo up here as the introduction? And the reason is because, in a sense, through a series of steps, one might say that Liu Xiaobo is in prison because of the kind of system that Deng Xiaoping helped create in 1949 and then continued to maintain in power after he himself came to power in 1979. So I don't have a clicker, but I have a very distinguished helper here. Dr. Widener is going to, so yes, next, okay? So here we go, and I think that this is more or less correct Chinese. If it's not, tell me afterwards, not now. I looked it up in the Oxford English Chinese Dictionary and tried to do my best. Okay, so Deng Xiaoping, first of all, his dates are 1904, 1997. So he died 18 years ago, and the first question, I guess, is why should we bother even to talk about him now? Well, the publication of my friend's book, this is a book that was actually written by a friend of mine who I think is one of the most distinguished historians of 20th century China, Alexander Pantsov, who was trained in Moscow back in the old Soviet Union, is now an American citizen, teaches in Ohio, and has written what I think are generally considered to be the best biography in English of Mao Zedong and the best biography of Deng Xiaoping, which is quite an accomplishment. He's now working on a biography of Chiang Kai-shek. And my role in this, as Dina Mansour mentioned in the beginning, was to translate these books from Russian, which their original language published in, to edit them, to delete large quantities which wouldn't have been publishable because they were too big. So Dr. Pantsov has written the book, and I've unwritten part of it. And I'm not quite sure, maybe in academia, you get credit for unwriting books? So, it's not a bad idea, actually. and also done some editing. So those are my credentials. The other thing is that since authenticity is required with speakers, except if your name is Donald Trump, I suppose, then I'd like to say that I actually, on April 10th, 1974, sat in the gallery of the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York City when none other than Deng Xiaoping came and gave a speech to the General Assembly, a special session of the General Assembly. And sitting up in the peanut gallery, way high up, barely being able to see this very small figure, when he appeared, all the delegates stood up and there was an enormous round of applause. And it was quite a spectacular moment. And this had been his first appearance in public after his return from his second, well, no, actually from his second, I've lost track now, of his being demoted. So he had, there's a Chinese expression, budawang, which means a doll that doesn't fall over. You can push it, there's probably some English word for this. I don't know what it is. So he had been battered, pushed over, came back up onto his feet, and it happened again a couple of years later. But April 1974 was his moment in the international spotlight, and there I was looking down at him and trying to understand his Sichuanese accent, which proved to be impossible. I was listening in, and what is this guy saying? No idea. Anyway, okay, so next, so there are two, by the way, this is my first and probably last PowerPoint I'm going to do in my life. Decided that I spent 40 years teaching without this stuff, and so now I was thinking if my 5-year-old granddaughter were here, she could have helped me put this together in a much more sophisticated way. But she's not, so I had to do it on my own with some help from my wife. Anyway, okay, what is Deng Xiaoping's legacy? Why are we studying him? And the reason, I think, is because next to Mao Zedong himself, who died in 1976, Deng Xiaoping is the most important figure, political figure in 20th century Chinese history. And that's a very large statement to make, I think, but I think that his record, both of longevity and of service to the Chinese Communist Party, which he joined in the 1920s, I'll say a little bit about his biography in a moment or two, validates the claim that his life is worth studying. And the China that exists today, there are two components of it. So we have here Shenzhen, which back in the, yeah, sure, thank you. Is this water or something stronger? I'm just joking. So Shenzhen is a city that sprung up out of almost nothing, just a village at the time of Mao's death in 1976. And now it's a huge metropolis in southern China and the center of all kinds of manufacturing and whatnot. And this is one of the legacies of Deng Xiaoping. Next. And then, of course, here we have, this is a picture of Tiananmen Square, June 4th, the massacre there. Most of the killing didn't occur in the square itself, so that the Chinese government can say there was no Tiananmen massacre. So it took place 3 blocks away. Big deal, is that? Anyway, Deng Xiaoping, it's quite clear from the historical record from a collection called the Tiananmen Papers, which was edited by 2 friends of mine, Andrew Nathan and Perry Link, demonstrates that Deng Xiaoping personally was responsible for the decision that led to the massacre of somewhere between several hundred and several thousand Chinese citizens in Beijing on the night of June 3rd, June 4th, 1989. Numerically, in terms of the deaths that have occurred in China since 1949, even the upper figure of several thousand is trivial, because a scholar, a very well-known scholar in Wisconsin, Edward Friedman, recently estimated that from 1949 to the present, the Chinese Communist regime, in one way or another, has been responsible for something like between 40 and 60 million unnecessary deaths, most of them, of course, in the Great Famine of the late 1950s, but others in various political campaigns going back to 1949 into the early 1950s. Okay, so the question is, which of these, how do we understand Deng Xiaoping? Do we lay the accent on the first part, the economic development that occurred on his watch? What role did he play in that? or should he be remembered basically as the continuer of someone like Mao Zedong himself, who outstripped all the 20th century dictators, it seems to me, in terms of his responsibility for mass human death? Next. So here is what I'd like to talk about, and I better read it so I know what I said. You can read that yourself. I'm not one of the speakers who's going to read for you. I assume literacy, basic literacy here anyway. And so let's, okay, next. Okay, so how did Deng Xiaoping become a communist or a Bolshevik to begin with? He grew up, he was born in 1904, the tail end of the last Chinese imperial dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, in southwest China, in Sichuan, to a very wealthy family, actually. So later on, in fact, he had to protect his family because the communists themselves would have probably imprisoned some of his relatives because he had the wrong class background. He was educated at his father's expense, first in his hometown, and then at the age of 16, the tender age of 16, he went off to France in 1920 as a young man. This shows him there. He was, I think his maximum height was 4'11". He's looking rather chipper there. I'm not sure exactly when that was taken or where, but around this time. And he went to France to study on something called a work-study program, in which Chinese students, for the most part, went to France on the supposition that they would work for a year in a factory, make enough money to go to school, and then they would combine both work and study. Deng Xiaoping's experience in France was not a very happy one, except that he acquired a lifelong like for croissant and for coffee, which is not a bad thing, I suppose, to acquire in France. But he was never able to go to school very long. He ran out of money. He worked in various factories, and he experienced the life of a French working man at a time that the French economy was in trouble, and furthermore, in which Chinese, people of any kind of Asian background, Chinese or Vietnamese, were looked down upon by French workers. It was in that milieu of a working class environment, very different from the family in which he'd grown up, that he encountered Marxism-Leninism. 1920, just 3 years after the Russian Revolution, was a time when the Communist International was spreading its gospel of Marxism-Leninism around the world. The French Communist Party was formed at that time. Chinese students in France, along with Ho Chi Minh, by the way, the Vietnamese revolutionary, also were first involved in communism through the French Communist Party. This is a kind of interesting thing, I think. Anyway, he got involved in communist activities as a very young man. He lived in a dormitory with other Chinese workers who were themselves communists before he was, and gradually he absorbed the ideas that they were telling him about. But he never really studied very much. He was not a student of Marxism-Leninism in the way that Mao Zedong had been, for example, or some of the other early founders of the Chinese Communist Party. Marxism-Leninism was the only philosophy, the only system of thought that he ever really absorbed in any case. And he did it as a young man, and it stayed with him for the rest of his life. So he was not a person who was open to lots of ideas. And in fact, as we'll see in a few moments, when he came to power after Mao's death, he very specifically acted to prevent the dissemination of ideas which he thought were dangerous. Ideas which probably most of us have in our heads at this moment, by the way. Okay, next. Okay, so here we go. Oh, so then after he and his Chinese comrades who were communists were being pursued by the French police, and in 1926 they fled. They were living under assumed names and whatnot and producing communist propaganda, and the French police were on their trail, and they left. And Deng Xiaoping went to Moscow in 1926, and he enrolled in a university that had been established by the Russian Bolsheviks for Chinese students, a kind of training academy for Chinese revolutionaries. And there were a similar academy for students from other countries around the world, by the way. So this is a time when Stalin was just coming into power, but in which there was a kind of moderate form of Bolshevism. Maybe a contradiction in terms, but in terms of Russian history, a fairly moderate form of Bolshevism. And that's what Deng Xiaoping studied in the school there. He never learned French, by the way. He was in France for 5 years. He was in the Soviet Union for 1 year, never learned very much Russian either. In other words, he was not a brilliant language student, but he studied very hard and he got very good marks. So he was noted to be someone with great organizational skills, someone who was very loyal to the organization. That's a key point. From the time he was young to the time that he died, his life was really devoted, his loyalty was to the communist organization. So there's a nice Russian word for this, apparatchik, someone who worked in the apparatus, and that's really what he was from a very early age. Okay, next. Okay, so then in 1926, 1927, there was a big revolution in China, a nationalist revolution. The communists tried to seize power. In 1927, they failed. And in the years thereafter, Deng Xiaoping, Mao Zedong, and the real leaders of the Communist Party went into a kind of internal exile. They fled to the countryside and the mountains. They tried to survive. Chiang Kai-shek was the person in power. And Deng Xiaoping was sent to southwest China in a kind of low position as the leader of a county military political organization. And since I don't have time to go into details, let's say that his career there was not a raging success. The communists failed. The revolution in that particular area was suppressed, and Deng Xiaoping and others then wound up in the communist capital in southwest China, in southeast China, the Chinese Soviet Republic, whose leader was Mao Zedong. And so there, in other words, there was a state within a state. There was the China ruled by Chiang Kai-shek, and then within that China, there was an area in which the communists had established their power with military force, and in which they were trying to hold on and expand their political authority. In 1934, after a series of campaigns, Chiang Kai-shek had the communists on the run, and they went on this famous Long March, which is part of the sort of legend of Chinese communist history. You know, a glorious, wonderful thing. In fact, it was a tremendous defeat. 86,000 people started on the march, and 5,000 wound up. You know, this is probably a much lower percentage than people who do the marathon in Missoula, or even the half marathon, I would think. So, but they wound up finally in northwest China and established a base there in 1935, 1936. And Deng Xiaoping was part of this group. He survived along with Mao. And the communists then in 1936, 1937, again were in a part of China that was fairly inaccessible to Chiang Kai-shek's troops, but what saved them basically from being exterminated was the Japanese invasion. Let me rush forward for a moment and say in 1964, a group of Japanese socialist politicians came to Beijing and had a meeting with Mao Zedong, who was the chairman of the Communist Party, and they came to apologize for Japanese aggression. And Mao Zedong said, "Oh, don't do it. You don't need to apologize, because without Japan's attacking China, I wouldn't be in power." Now, that's not something that contemporary Chinese focus on, to put it mildly, but I think Mao Zedong was correct. The 1937-1945 war, in which Japan attacked and tried to control China, was the period in which the Chinese Communist Party expanded enormously. Before that, it had been a marginal group with a small number of army troops. The party membership was not very great either. And I think that without the intervention, the invasion rather, of Japan, that over a period of years, the communist insurrection, which is what it was, would have been exterminated. I mean, this is the fate of most communist revolutionaries in the 20th century. The revolutionary success rate is, I'm a baseball fan, so I put it sort of like batting, 150 or something like that, which doesn't get you out of, the Pioneer League even. But the Communist Party expanded enormously during the course of the Sino-Japanese War. And in 1945, it already had an army of 1 million people. It controlled a territory of about 95 million people, so maybe a fifth of the population of China. And Deng Xiaoping, during the war, 1937-1945, next, I think it's, okay, here we go. So I'm down to the middle there, more or less, 1937-1945. Deng Xiaoping had served with a very famous Chinese communist general. He himself became very schooled in military affairs. He was a very good strategist and tactician, and the area which he helped to control became one of the major bases of the Chinese Communist Party in the civil war that followed between 1946 and 1949. So, okay, 1949, October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stands up on the Tiananmen rostrum in Beijing and declares the foundation of the People's Republic of China. By this time, working his way up through the party hierarchy, having attached himself to Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping already is one of the major figures in the Chinese Communist Party, which is very hierarchy conscious, by the way. You know, egalitarianism is the philosophy on the ground, but in fact it's a very hierarchical system. And you can look at the pecking order very clearly. And Deng Xiaoping in the early 1950s was sort of number 5 in the hierarchy, depending on his position. So very close to the center of power. In the early days of the People's Republic, China was divided up into regional areas. Deng Xiaoping was put in charge of the southwest, which included Sichuan, China's most populous province, and it also then included Tibet, which was invaded and taken over 1950-1951 by Chinese communist troops. So what the Communist Party was doing, and Deng Xiaoping was part of this process, was reoccupying areas that had been part of the Manchu Empire before it fell apart in 1912. Then in 1952, next please. I don't remember even what's on the order here, but okay. Yeah, so 1952, Deng Xiaoping is brought back to Beijing to be with the central leadership, and this is an important part of his career. And here he's meeting with, I'm not going to test you on these figures, I'm testing myself from the left, Zhu De, Zhou Enlai, Chen Yun, Liu Shaoqi, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and somebody else. Forgotten who that other person is. So he's right up there in the pantheon of the major leaders, and the major position that he occupies during this period is the head of the secretariat of the organization department. The organization department of the Communist Party makes personnel appointments. So if you control personnel appointments, you have a lot of power right there, and a lot of people owe you favors. I appoint you to office, and then if I need you, I can call upon you to help me with whatever my projects are. The main thing here, the main point I'd like to make, though, is that the person who was calling all the shots, and there were many shots, in fact, was Mao Zedong, and Mao Zedong was the person whose approval or disapproval could make or break someone's career just with a snap of the fingers, if I could do that. Next. So the first decade of the PRC, 1949, 1959, is often seen as a kind of golden age. But in fact, 1951, 1952, there was a great big campaign against landlords and their families, a very broad category. Perhaps 2 million people were killed in that campaign. 1957, there was a big campaign, the anti-rightist campaign, in which 500,000 educated people, intellectuals, were attacked for having bourgeois capitalist thinking, liberal thinking. Deng Xiaoping was the hatchet man for Mao Zedong in that position. So in fact, until the 1970s, which I'll come to very soon, because I do want to leave some room for Q&A, until the 1970s, anything that Mao Zedong ordered Deng Xiaoping to do, he did. And that was the secret of his own rise in the power. He sucked up to the chairman. That was the way to make a career. If you crossed the chairman, Chairman Mao, in even the slightest way, which the then Minister of Defense had done in 1959, then you were out of power. So Deng Xiaoping realized that very early on, and the trick of staying in power then was to guess what Chairman Mao really meant. He often spoke in very kind of vague terms. kind of like a Chinese sphinx. And people had to listen to him and try to figure out, what does he really mean? If you got it wrong, you were in serious trouble. But Deng Xiaoping was a very bright, very capable person, and he got it right most of the time, and he executed the chairman's desires. Then along comes the culture, so this includes, by the way, the Great Leap Forward of 1958, 1962, in which somewhere between 25 and 45 million Chinese died. 25 and 45 million. We'll never know the exact number, as a result of a famine that came about not because of natural disasters, which is what the Chinese textbooks tell you, but because of political decisions made in Beijing by Mao Zedong and the people around him, including Deng Xiaoping, which led to, we don't have time to go into, a series of cascading disasters, which led to this largest single loss of life in human history as a result of political decision. 1966, okay, I'm sorry. One other thing that Deng Xiaoping did in the 1950s, I should say, is that he became China's point man in Moscow as well as in Beijing for negotiations with the Soviet Union. Stalin had died in 1953. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev gave his famous secret speech, which was leaked very soon to the New York Times, other places, and criticizing Stalin. And after that, Sino-Soviet relations, which had been very close, began to fall apart. Mao Zedong got it into his head that the Soviet Union was no longer a communist state, that it was undergoing a process of degeneration. It was becoming capitalist or revisionist. And so Deng Xiaoping was sent to Moscow to argue with the Soviets, and he did it very effectively. And so that was another feather in his cap, giving him status with the chairman because he had carried out the chairman's will in battling against Soviet revisionism. Okay, then along comes the Cultural Revolution in 1965, 1966, and Mao Zedong now begins to think that China itself, his own Communist Party, is being threatened by revisionism. That unless something drastic is done, Chinese bureaucrats will wind up like Soviet bureaucrats, fat, happy, and not at all revolutionary. So Mao Zedong has a sense that the revolution is it's his personal property, and it's being threatened by people in his own entourage, including his second in command, Liu Shaoqi, and others as well, including Premier Zhou Enlai, and that something drastic must be done in order to save the revolution, his revolution, from the Communist Party, which was the instrument for creating the revolution in the first place. Does that sound crazy? I hope so. In retrospect. What's paranoid? Yes, But and in that process, what happened was that Liu Shaoqi, who had been designated Mao's successor, was purged. He wound up 3 years later dying of pneumonia in a room in a provincial city with untended, no medical help or anything like that. And Deng Xiaoping was designated the number two person in authority walking the capitalist road. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? The number two person in authority walking the capitalist road. And as such, he too was purged, but he survived because Mao still thought of him as different because of his organizational skills. But so he and his wife, his third wife, the first one died shortly after childbirth. The second wife deserted him because she thought that he was politically incorrect. Those stories are told in the book, by the way. So Deng Xiaoping and his third wife then were sent out to Jiangxi province, where he worked in a factory, and he was told that he had to improve his thinking, he had to transform his thinking. So for a couple of years he was totally out of power, and he had to absorb the thoughts of the proletarians and the working class in the tractor factory where he was working. And he kept writing to Mao Zedong and said, please, I'm paraphrasing, please forgive me, I now will be faithful again to you forever, and I will not do anything to displease you. And so Mao kept putting him off, but finally, 1973, just the year before I heard him at the UN, he's brought back to Beijing. Premier Zhou Enlai is dying of cancer, and they need somebody who can run the show. So who is there around? There is Deng Xiaoping. So Deng Xiaoping is brought back to Beijing, and he's given power as a deputy premier. So he's, from a sort of tractor technician, all of a sudden he's vaulted back into power because Mao can do that. He can sort of pull him up by the strings, and Deng is back in power. So things go well for a while, but then as Mao is dying, 1975, 1976, there's a fierce power struggle going on in China. And Deng Xiaoping now is seen by Mao's wife and her associates, the so-called Gang of Four, as responsible again for revisionism. So Deng Xiaoping at the end of 1975 is stripped of his power. In 1976, a big campaign is carried out against him. And again, I'll share very briefly here, take just 45 seconds, I hope, personal memoir. I was in China in April and May 1976 for the first time in my life. And the group I was with visited a kindergarten with all these cute Chinese kids dancing around and singing the song. And the song they were singing was, "We shall criticize Deng Xiaoping," who was a right-wing revisionist. So not your normal nursery rhyme, but it sounded very nice, and I understood what was being said, and the rest of my group did not. Okay, next, please. Okay, so here is Deng. So in 1978, Deng comes back into power. Mao has died in 1976. There's a power struggle. There's an interim figure who's kind of inept leader, and Deng succeeds in using his connections that he got together as a result of his long career beforehand to engineer his return to power. And what happens, and this is the most interesting part, I think, is that while he was in exile, while he was fixing tractors or whatever he was doing in the countryside, he began to think for the first time in his life really about what he was doing. What was the cause that I've devoted my life to? Is the Maoist form of revolution really workable? Earlier already he had gotten into trouble by quoting a famous proverb from somewhere, and he said, it doesn't matter if the cat is yellow or white. I'm sorry, is black or yellow. We see it as white, but it was actually yellow in Chinese. It doesn't matter if the cat is black or yellow as long as it catches mice. Okay, remember that. If you didn't know that, you should commit this to memory. It may come in handy at some point. I can't imagine where or how. But what it summarized was Deng Xiaoping's sort of pragmatism. And what he was saying basically is that the Maoist experiment has failed. China in 1976 was still a backward, underdeveloped country in many ways. It had alienated all of its partners, the Soviet Union, India, other countries that had been favorable to it. All of those had been alienated. And what was left now was a country that was technologically backward, cut off from the world, with a large number of enemies and very few allies. Something had to be done. So what Deng Xiaoping was to go through Mao's writings, or have someone do it for him, most likely, and come up with a Maoist phrase, seek truth from facts. In other words, let's stop fantasizing. Let's look at the reality of what China is like, and let us take the steps that we need to in order to accomplish the goals of the revolution, which are to make China prosperous and powerful. That hasn't happened under Mao, is what he said. But he does not discard Mao, because if you discard Mao, then you discard the legitimacy, the supposed legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. You can't get rid of Mao. That's why Mao is still in his mausoleum in central Beijing. That's why his portrait is still over the Tiananmen Square, and why his face is on all the larger bills of Chinese currency, by the way. Only the small bills have anything other than Mao. So, okay, so what Deng Xiaoping does not have a program in mind. He doesn't have any kind of grand scheme, but he's willing to experiment. And so the early 1980s are a period of experimentation in which basically what the Chinese Communist Party under Deng's leadership is willing to do is to try stuff out. If it works, we'll do it. If it doesn't work, we won't do it. You know, if the cat is yellow, if the cat is black, doesn't matter. let's try this thing. And so what happens basically is a program of economic reform. We don't have time to go into it. The result of which, over the period of the 1980s, is to transform what had been a totally state-dominated economy into a mixed economy with foreign direct investment coming in, with special economic zones for processing, foreign technology coming in, reconnecting China up with an international economic system in a way that it had not been connected since the 1930s and 1940s. So there's a revolution in economics that is going on to this day. And Shenzhen, the big city skyline I showed you before, is one of the many results of that program. The transformation of Shanghai is another one. In the process of political struggle after Mao died, Deng Xiaoping briefly endorsed the idea of political openness. In 1978, early 1979, there was something called the Democracy Wall in China, in which Chinese dissidents and critics said that what we need to do is open up the country not only economically but political ideas. And a young, very courageous young man named Wei Jingsheng, 26 years old at the time, said what China needs as its fifth modernization — there were 4 other modernization programs in agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology, I think. The fifth modernization must be democratization. And that was a very bold thing to say, and for a while it got a lot of attention, but then Wei Jingsheng was arrested on orders of Deng Xiaoping and imprisoned for 15 years. The point I want to make here is that in the 1980s and in the 1990s, what Deng Xiaoping drew the line at was any kind of political liberalization. In 1986, in October, I was at a conference in Beijing, sitting next to friends of mine, all of whom were members of the Chinese Communist Party, and they were talking about a free press and a multi-party system. And I thought I was hearing wrong. They were talking very fast, and my ear had to speed up, from whatever it was, the slow RPMs to the fast one to get, or I guess it's the other way around, I guess, actually, technologically. And I turned to my friend and I said, am I hearing correctly that you guys are talking about a free press and a multi-party system? He said, yes, 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 and they went on doing it. In the late 80s, there was an opportunity for China to transform in a way that would have made it today possibly a democratic country. But in 1987, first of all, the chief proponent of that within the Chinese Communist Party was purged, a man named Hu Yaobang. And then in 1989, in the spring of 1989, you had this nationwide movement starting in April 1989, continuing until June 4th, in which not only in Beijing, but in scores of cities throughout China.
Just randomly moving ahead.
Okay, sorry, okay. So, disconnect, that's it, that's fine. I'm used to being disconnected. In scores of cities around China, millions of people participated in what was a national movement for political change, not to overthrow the Communist Party, but to see it reform itself from within. From the perspective of Deng Xiaoping, this was a primary threat to the power of the Communist Party, and he was not willing to let that go. So he had already articulated these 4 cardinal principles, which are still part of the current system. Next, whatever next is here, let's see. Okay, so Deng Xiaoping also became a statesman in the 1980s. Here he's meeting with the Harlem Globetrotters. And they really are tall, and he really is short, by the way. Next. And then here he is with Mikhail Gorbachev and Raisa Gorbacheva in 1989 when the Sino-Soviet summit occurred in Beijing. Next. Okay, so April 1989 is when Hu Yaobang dies. This huge demonstrations occur around the country, and then what to do about it. Within the leadership of the Communist Party, there were a couple of people who were willing to dialogue with the students and to have a connection between the Chinese Communist leadership and Chinese society. They were willing to take that risk and see what happened. But the large majority were unwilling to do that and felt that their life's work would be destroyed at the hands of these crazy teenagers and people in their early 20s who were not committed to the revolution in the same way. And so Deng Xiaoping's response in 1989 was typical of his entire career, which was to use force in order to achieve a political objective without any qualms whatsoever. Let's do it. Let's get it over with. And so that's what happened on June 3rd, 4th, 1989. And the consequence, if you put that into global perspective, is that 1989 was a year of enormous change in the communist world. On June 4th, the Poles in Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, voted in a free election for the first time and got rid of communism. In the fall of that year, the Berlin Wall fell. I don't have time to go into all this history, but the point was that 1989 was a year of transformation that started in Beijing. It started in China, and it failed in China, and it succeeded in most other places. And then 2 years later, of course, 1991, the Soviet Union itself fell. The fall of the Soviet Union then was of critical importance to the mentality of the Chinese leadership, because they felt if the founding country of communism has fallen, then we could go next. And so they consolidated their authority from that point on, continuing to this day. Okay, next. Okay, so there is this famous picture that you've seen, and for me what this recapitulates really is the state represented by the tanks versus Chinese society. There's one person here. The Chinese state, dominated by the Communist Party, showed its willingness yet again to use whatever force was necessary to retain its control of Chinese society. Next. So, here we have socialism with Chinese characteristics. What does that mean? It can mean anything. In terms of economics, well, the bottom line, once again, is that the Chinese Communist Party will stay in power. Without us, chaos comes afterwards. That's what the Chinese leadership says. China's role in the world under Deng Xiaoping became much more important, but it was still a much more cautious role than it has been since, particularly under Xi Jinping. So the CCP in tight control make sure that Western universal values, which in my mind, sound pretty good, but universal values in the Chinese context mean Western democracy, Western liberalism, free press, competition, all these kinds of things, which would erode or undermine the power of the Chinese Communist Party. So those are all have to be opposed, and they continue to be opposed by the present leadership. So I guess in conclusion I'd say there's really a very mixed legacy here. I mean, Deng Xiaoping lived a very long life. It covered most of the 20th century, from the period of the Qing dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, until the post-Mao period of the late 1990s. And the China that exists today, I think, is really more, in a sense, the legacy of Deng Xiaoping than anyone else, even of Mao Zedong. One final thought, and that is, politically speaking, did Deng succeed in what he wanted to do? One of his major goals was to make sure that there would never again be a leader as powerful as Mao Zedong, who would be able to do whatever he wanted to. In that fashion, he's failed. Xi Jinping, the current leader, has aggregated power in a way very much like Mao Zedong did, and there's no countervailing forces. An end to corruption, another aspect. Has that worked? No, it has not. I mean, China is one of the most corrupt countries in the world, endless fights against corruption. And finally, China is also now, socialism with Chinese characteristics, one of the countries with the largest economic disparities in the world, larger even than the United States. So, okay, I've taken more time than I should have, but I will stop there. I think, let's see, do we have one more? I think the last slide is a picture of the book. Yeah, there it is. So, okay. Questions, comments, objections, suggestions? Anyone? Yeah, please.
I'm not sure I can put this together quite right, but I'm remembering the United States and the anti-war movement, and a lot of people, at least in the part of the world I lived in at that point, were with their Mao hats and
Yes, yes.
buttons and everything, and wondering about how, what kind of an interface there was between what was going on in China during the Vietnam War, and how the Vietnam War may have affected what happened in China, what was going on.
Yeah, that's a very interesting and complicated question. Can we stay here until 2? I mean, I myself was part of the anti-war movement as a student in graduate school. First of all, I think that China's anti-imperialist policies attracted people on the left, certainly. And so the Vietnam War then was sold in this country as part of a way to stop Chinese communism, in fact. So the Vietnamese communists were supposedly agents of the Chinese, which wasn't true, to be sure, but it was a way of presenting it to the American people. And therefore, for people who opposed the war, then China looked good to some of them. Not to me, but to some of them. So there was a kind of, I don't know how you, sort of ricochet effect, maybe, something like that politically. Then Mao Zedong himself issued statements in favor of the civil rights movement, for example. On the day of the March on Washington, August 28, 1963, Mao Zedong issued a statement in support of the black people's liberation struggle. I don't think it had any effect really on that struggle, to be sure, but it was a symbolic act of support. And then also support for the anti-war movement. So I think that at a time of rapid social change in the United States, the image of a China that itself was undergoing revolutionary change was very attractive to certain numbers of people. And there were dyed-in-the-wool American Maoists, to be sure. And there was a Communist Party Marxist-Leninist that was led by some guy named Robert Avakian. Is he here in the room, by the way? Okay. Which continued, and in fact, when Deng Xiaoping came to Washington in February 1979, as the post-Mao leader who had repudiated more or less Mao, Robert Avakian chained himself to the White House fence and protest against this revisionist who had come into town. So there was an intricate interplay there, to be sure. And that's, I think, as much as I can say in the time that we have, okay? Yes, please.
I'm just interested. I'm Dan Spencer. I teach environmental studies program, and I teach a course on globalization. And one of the promises of the folks who kind of promote a laissez-faire neoliberal form of globalization is that it kind of inevitably brings democratization to countries that take it there. But then you've got countries like China or Vietnam that don't seem to be moving rapidly ahead with free market economic reforms, but don't seem to see loosening up much of the single party control. And I'm wondering if you've looked at that or thought at all about Deng Xiaoping's place in that.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, I think in the 1990s, during the Clinton era, if we can call it the Clinton era, there was this notion, both in Washington and in Wall Street and elsewhere, Wall Street Journal had editorials about this, that this is going to be the inevitable march towards freedom and democracy. And I think what it was basically was either simple ignorance or stupidity on the one hand, or more likely sort of wishful thinking. We want to engage with these people with China for economic reasons, and therefore we can then console ourselves with the thought that by engaging them economically, then a middle class will arise and it will make political demands and there'll be a happy ending. And one of the many reasons why that didn't work, I'll just cite one of them, is that the Chinese leadership, as I mentioned before, thought about this possibility and said, we are going to preemptively, prophylactically make sure this doesn't happen, so that we're going to engage with the world. In fact, Deng Xiaoping's critics said that if we open the doors up, all kinds of terrible things will come in, you know, flies and roaches and whatever else flies in. And Deng Xiaoping said, we can put up a screen, we can keep out the bad stuff and take in only the good stuff. And the bad stuff was universal values, political ideals, including democracy, and the good stuff was investment from the United States and from Taiwan and from Japan and everywhere else. So, actually, the Communist Party leadership carefully studied the experience of the Soviet Union, and they said Gorbachev was the problem. He shouldn't have liberalized politically. He did things the wrong way. He's responsible for the end of the collapse of the Soviet regime. We must make sure nothing like that happens here. And so from early childhood right through university education, children in China are taught over and over again, without the Communist Party there is no new China. Without the Communist Party, chaos will break out. Without the Communist Party, China would not be strong and prosperous. And so after 20 years or whatever it is with that kind of propaganda in the guise of education, then most Chinese students apparently, at least at this moment, accept that the Chinese leadership, as it is now constituted, is the only leadership that could succeed in continuing China on the road to global power status. I mean, there's a lot more to be said about that, but I think that's a piece of it anyway. Yeah, please.
Do you have any gut feeling about the future as it moves on forward with either China economically or their political structure, or is there going to be an implosion over there? Do you feel like they're setting themselves up for this?
Well, I mean, there are all kinds of strains in the system that the Chinese leadership is aware of, certainly, economic strains and political strains. And so far, I mean, in terms of the security possibilities inside of an implosion, there are multi-layered systems of control. I mean, the educational system is one, but there's also the army, and there's People's Armed Police, and there's an elaborate security system of surveillance of dissidents. I mean, most of the dissidents now in China are either under surveillance or in prison. The lawyers who defended the dissidents are themselves imprisoned. So any kind of attempt to try to introduce kind of buds of democracy, you might say, or liberalization, are on the radar screen of the Chinese leadership. They also patrol the internet enormously. There are, what is it, 80,000 or something like that, an army of people who scour the internet all the time. And if you put up something that is not to be put up, it will vanish almost instantaneously in a little while. In fact, a Chinese review of the Mao Zedong biography that my friend Alexander Pantsov published, the book was published in China itself in a somewhat expurgated version, by the way. I don't have time to go into that now. And a review was put up on the Chinese internet, and it lasted for 20 minutes before it was taken down. So these guys are at the top of their game. I don't like their game, but they're good at what they do. Economically, it's hard to tell. I don't know. I mean, there are enormous problems in the Chinese economy. I'm not an economist, and Terry Widener has already given his talk last year, so I can't call upon him now. But, I think, I'd say one thing, that the track record of foreign experts predicting China's future has been abysmal. And that actually makes me feel good, because I don't think that we should be engaged in that, really. Because as a scholar and an academic, I've increasingly been turning towards history rather than politics. I think political science has a very important role to play in the academy, but its predictive value for something as complicated and inchoate as China's future is beyond the scope of any methodology, I think.
You mentioned that the Mao book had been published in China. Are you aware of bootleg copies of either book on the streets, Chinese translations, and if there's any conversation in China going on about the book?
Well, actually, there are two Chinese editions of the Mao book. One was published in Taiwan and sold in Hong Kong. And if any book sold in Hong Kong can be bought in Hong Kong by visitors from China and brought into the country. So we have no idea how many copies are there. I was joking to my friend Pantsov that I'm hoping that Xi Jinping has a copy of Mao next to on his bedside table. You know, it's possible, I suppose. The Chinese version, I mean, the version published in mainland China in the PRC was just published recently, actually, by People's University Press, which is a very official communist press. And let me see if I can give you a very brief version of the story there. So Pantsov said, before I give my okay, there has to be, you have to send me the page proofs. So they sent him the page proofs, and he discovered 50 or 60 excisions or something like that. And he wrote back and he said, no, this is not acceptable. And so anyway, the editor then finally, they negotiated back and forth, and finally the editor said, this is as much as I can do, because if I accept what you want me to do, then the book won't be published at all. So I'll just give you one example of it. So one of the words in the book was describing Mao Zedong as a dictator. So that was a no-no. You couldn't call Mao Zedong a dictator. So instead, the Chinese phrase translates in English as an iron-fisted ruler. Okay, so that was okay. You could be an iron-fisted ruler, but not a dictator. And there were some other things like that as well. But any foreign author who publishes a book in China is subject to Chinese censorship. And a lot of people have had much worse experiences than Pantsov has with books published in China, that they thought they had an agreement with the publisher, but when it appears, hey, you know, where is that sentence that I insisted was important? It's not there. So the question is whether you make compromises. Do you settle for 90% of your book? The other major book on Deng Xiaoping published in large quantities in China was by one of my professors at Harvard, Ezra Vogel, called Deng Xiaoping and the Transformation of China. And Professor Vogel agreed to substantial changes in his book so that it could be published there. So it depends on what what your threshold is, I guess, of acceptance of Chinese censorship. The Deng Xiaoping book, which Chinese publishers have also expressed interest in, would be subject to much greater censorship even because of Deng Xiaoping is still a very important person. And I have told our publisher, which is Oxford University Press, that I would not allow my name to be on any version of a Deng book published in the PRC. I just wouldn't trust that. So, well, okay, thank you very much for coming.